Father, what a privilege it is to know you. I thank you for each and every one of these men and women in this room right here, God. These people truly are family. And it's not only a privilege to know you, God, but it's a privilege to have this family of believers, God, that we get to gather together regularly, to meet up, to break bread, to celebrate you, God. And above all of that, God, the fact that we get to study your word together. That's an amazing privilege, God. There are so many people throughout history who would have longed to have this privilege. There are so many people who would have longed to have such access to Scripture as we now have, God. And we've got it. So as we go into your word, please let us not take that for granted, but let your Spirit be present with us, working through us and guiding us into understanding. Like Solomon is going to pray for today, God, I pray that you will give us discerning hearts, right? So that we will not only be able to understand what the Scripture says, but that we'll be able to understand it as you would have it be understood, and we'll be able to apply it as you would have it be applied. And then, just like Solomon prayed for wisdom to go out and govern your people, I pray that you will raise us up to be leaders who can help guide your people into further communion with you. We love you, God. We praise you. We thank you for the opportunity you've given us to know you and to know one another and to love you and to love one another. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Today we are in 1 Kings chapter 3. And today we are going to be talking about the wisdom of King Shlomo. King Solomon. Shlomo is how you pronounce his name in Hebrew. It's kind of fun. That being said, there is some context to be recapped here. Broadly speaking, I will remind you that basically what we're talking about right now is the reign of King Solomon. Right? We spent over a year going through the story of Samuel and Saul and David in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And we got to see how David's reign came to an end last week. Right? But in particular, let's see if maybe we can summarize chapters 1 and 2 just for our own clarity so that we can remember what just happened, but also for the sake of people who, we're recording this and people are watching it right now, and maybe it'd be useful for them to recap it in the event that they haven't seen the previous 2 videos, because you got to keep in mind those videos are like 2 hours each, and so if somebody's wanting to catch up, they got to watch 4 hours worth of material, and maybe they don't have time to do that, right? So let's see, can we get somebody to recap just chapter 1? What happens in the very beginning of 1 Kings?
David was on his deathbed, and he wasn't dead yet, but he was very sick, and Adonijah wanted to become king, and he did it. He planned the whole thing himself, and it just wasn't meant to be because of that, and David wanted King Solomon to become king, and Solomon just naturally became king, just like David did. And then when Adonijah heard that that his half brother Solomon became king, he was like, "Oh, I guess it wasn't my call then." And he went to the altar, grabbed onto it, and started to just beg and just wanted Solomon to give him mercy. And Solomon's like, "Bruh, just collect yourself. Bruh, just collect yourself and just go home. Go home." And it was just being a good brother to Adonijah. But then in chapter 2...
Well, let's do chapter 1 right there. Very good, very good. Yeah, so chapter 1 is all about how Solomon got to the throne. Right? So just like Maverick pointed out, David is on his deathbed. He's not quite dead yet, but he's old, he's cold, he's feeble. He even has this one woman named Abishag the Shunammite who they hired to cuddle with him, but they don't get anything weirder than that, even though that's kind of weird to us. But then Adonijah kind of tries to be a Absalom 2.0, right? To where, if you remember, Absalom was this one of David's sons who tried to steal the throne, and Adonijah seems to think that he can do what Absalom could not, but turns out he's just like Diet Absalom, right? He just can't even, like, he's not nearly as good at doing this as Absalom was, right? And so Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet, they come before David and they tell him what's going on, and David very quickly rectifies the situation by very quickly having a coronation ceremony for Solomon, right? To where Solomon ends up ascending to the throne, and he is sitting on the throne already by the time Adonijah's party's even over, right? And that's what leads to, like Maverick pointed out, Adonijah freaks out. He's like running through the streets. He runs to the place where the altar's at, and he's holding on to the horn of the altar, hoping for mercy. And Solomon grants him that mercy, right? He says, just go home. But Solomon clarifies that he's going to keep his eye on Adonijah, right? Because if Adonijah makes any other missteps, he's gone, right? Which leads us to chapter 2. Can I get somebody else to summarize chapter 2 for us?
The beginning of the chapter starts with David kind of like handing off the baton to Solomon, and he's basically telling him like how you can have a successful kingdom. And essentially he tells him that if you want to have a successful kingdom, you need to follow the same thing that Moses told the Israelites before Moses died and they were going into the promised land, that you need to follow God's commands with all your heart and with all your soul. And if you do that, then things will go well with you. And then David also gives like some advice to him about some different people that he sees that are being kind of sketchy, and is like, I'm not going to tell you to kill these people, I'm not going to tell you, but I'm just telling you that they could be an issue later down the road. So he gives them like some warnings about that. And then there's some people that he talks about, make sure that you like show kindness or show hesed to these people because they helped me at this point or that point. And then David dies, and then Adonijah, that's his name, right? He comes in and he tries to kind of like get his way like into the system so he can like have power, and he asked to have Abishag the Shunammite, which was the lady that was like sleeping next to David to keep him warm, wanted to have him like as a wife. And so he went to Bathsheba and was saying, you should tell this to Solomon. He was doing it in like really sneaky ways, and Solomon is like, no, that's not going to happen, like I can see right through that. And so he's not okay with that.
Yeah. So very good. Yeah, so really what chapter 2 is about is, if chapter 1 is about how Solomon got on the throne, chapter 2 is about how Solomon's throne was established, right? So we really see this transition phase, right? So David gives final words of advice to Solomon, and then David dies, right? He goes to rest with his fathers, he passes away. And then, immediately following that, we have Solomon actually following David's advice. Right? David had told him, hey, here's what it means to be a man. You need to be strong and courageous and follow after God. And then also, if you want to be a good king, watch out for these groups of people. Right? There's certain people you want to be careful with. Just keep your eye on them. You might have to kill them. And then there's other people you want to take care of because they took care of us. Right? So take care of the bad guys and don't forget about the good guys. Right? Reward those who support you because that will encourage people to support you. Right? That's how you be a good king. And so Solomon does that, right? So after Adonijah does his whole thing with Abishag, Solomon says, all right, dude, you pushed it too far, and he ends up having Adonijah killed. Joab hears about this, and Joab's like, oh crud, oh crud, oh crud, oh crud. I supported Adonijah, and Adonijah's dead, and so Joab tries to do what Adonijah did, and he goes and grabs the horns of the altar, and Solomon sends Benaiah after Joab, and he's like, just tell him to get off the altar. And Joab's like, no, you're going to have to kill me here. And Benaiah goes back to Solomon. And Solomon's like, he asked for it. I guess go kill him. And so he kills Joab, right? So there's Joab, he's taken out. And then there's Abiathar, the priest, right? And Abiathar, well, he also supported Adonijah. But Solomon's gracious, right? And Abiathar was a really good priest until he wasn't, right? And so Solomon basically defrocks him. He says, you know what? I have a lot of respect for you because you once were a great man, so I'm not going to kill you, but you can't be a priest anymore, right? You have proved, like, you opposed the Lord's anointed one, and so you need to get out of here. You're no longer a priest, right? But then there's also Shimei. Remember that dude? Shimei is the guy who tried to kill David by throwing stones at him whenever David was leaving Jerusalem, fleeing from Absalom. And that's another guy that David said, you need to watch out for him. And Solomon says, okay, Shimei, here's the deal. Right? You really messed up, and you should die, but instead I'm going to treat like what you did, rather than it being attempted murder, I'm going to treat it like accidental manslaughter, right? And I'm going to allow you to treat the city of Jerusalem like a city of refuge, where you can stay there, and if you stay in Jerusalem, nobody can harm you. But Shimei, if you leave Jerusalem, if you step 1 foot outside of Jerusalem, say goodbye to your life, right? Because I'm showing you mercy. And Shimei says, all right, sounds good to me. And then 3 years later, he leaves Jerusalem. I don't know why. I don't know if he was dumb. I don't know if he just didn't take Solomon at his word. For some reason, he left to go chase after some slaves, and he probably thought that he'd be forgiven for it. And Solomon says, dude, I told you what would happen. And so Shimei also is killed, right? And so we see one person after another getting like basically just like crossed off the list, right? And Solomon follows in his father's advice, right? And that leads us into chapter 3, which I've called the wisdom of King Solomon. But what I want you to notice is that Solomon has already demonstrated pretty good wisdom so far, right? Even before we get to this story, he seems like a pretty wise guy, and he's probably pretty young right now, right? He's probably 20 years old. Think about that, right? 20 years old, reigning over the people of God, right? That's wild, right? But he's probably about 20 years old at this time, just like if you do the math about like whenever David was probably with Bathsheba and stuff like that. He's probably 20 years old, if not a little bit younger than that. Reigning over the people of God, he seems to have a good head on his shoulders, right? He's showing people mercy, but he also knows when to like put his foot down and like, show them the law. And so he seems like a wise guy, but here we're going to see that he's going to ask for more wisdom, right? And he's not going to ask wisdom from just anybody. He's going to ask for wisdom from God, right? This is probably a story that many people are familiar with, but I'm really excited for it because it's only 28 verses long. The chapter, it's only 28 verses, which I remember the days whenever we used to go through books and we'd be like, man, this is a 15-verse chapter. It's a long one, guys. And we didn't know if we could get through it. But now I'm just happy to get a chapter that's under 30 verses because we've been dealing with such longer chapters. We can actually go a little bit more in depth today, right? And so let's hop into it. I'm going to put verses 1 through 5 on the screen, but let's just start with verses 1 and 2. Could you do verses 1 and 2, Sean?
Yeah. Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had completed building his own house, and the house of Yahweh and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of Yahweh until those days.
All right. Thank you. So we start off with this kind of weird little just like story here. It's not really directly going to tie into the stuff that follows it. And it doesn't necessarily tie into the stuff that preceded it. I'm assuming that this is literally just chronological information that happened at this point. That might kind of tie in, unless y'all can think of any other connections. But what do we see happening here?
Solomon's forming a marriage alliance with Pharaoh of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
What is marriage alliance?
Marriage alliance. What is a marriage alliance?
You marry this person, we won't kill you, or vice versa.
Well, yeah, so this was a thing that politicians would do back in the day, and even some still do it to this day. But this was a very common practice back in like ancient Middle Eastern times, right? In the ancient Near East, they would have marriage alliances, and basically this was a way of basically making a peace treaty with other nations, right? Because what you're doing whenever you're marrying somebody from another nation is you are welcoming them into your family, right? And that means that y'all are at peace with one another, and it's a lot less likely that you're going to go to war, right? Because if you marry Pharaoh's daughter, well, if he decides to go to war against you, he's going to war against his own flesh and blood, right? And so what you would do is this would just be a way for you to form alliances with one another. And so what it's mainly pointing out here is that the marriage was not something that inherently stemmed from love or something like that. It was more just an alliance, right? The big question you have to answer here, and scholars are split on this. Was this a good thing or a bad thing?
Bad.
Bad. Why do you say bad?
Egypt and the Israelites do not have a good relationship.
Okay. Yeah, so there's just like possibly just the contextual history of Egypt
religious differences and all kinds of other differences that
Mm-hmm.
are not supposed to collide.
Yeah. What else do y'all think?
The whole Solomon and the Pharaoh's daughter, that's so they're married, right? That's
Yes.
what a marriage alliance is.
Yeah.
It's not real love. It feels like they just have to do it.
It's
But
like
they're
an
not like
arranged
it's not like a
marriage.
covenant.
Yes, but well, it still is a covenant. And to be fair, you have to realize that marriage back in those days worked a little bit different than marriage nowadays, right? Where marriage nowadays, we make it all about romance and stuff like that. Well, that's not exactly how marriages worked for most of human history. You got to realize that's not how it works, right? Most marriages throughout human history have been community focused, right? It's about taking care of your family. And so I don't think you can immediately denounce it purely because it doesn't give you the ooey gooey Hallmark feelings, right? Sorry, what were you gonna say?
I lost it.
Okay.
I, I feel like it's kind of split because on one side it seems kind of wrong because if you think like back in the law whenever it talks about there being like foreign people that are coming, like Israel is meant to be a set apart nation, so when foreign people are coming in and if they're wanting to be part of the Israelites, they need to like adhere and have God, like Yahweh, as their God. And so whenever you have like Pharaoh's daughter coming in, well, her God is not Yahweh. It's some other foreign God, right? So like that's a sticky situation. But at the same time, on one side, it seems like Solomon is using that to his advantage so that he can build like the temple and the wall, so he can establish like God's house without having the threat of Egypt coming in and like destroying anything while he's trying to do that. So it seems like he's doing it like for God, but it also seems like a sticky situation. So it's kind of like torn in my head at least.
I 100% agree, right? And we didn't talk about this ahead of time,
Oh no.
right? The issue here, like, and people will take, like, they'll be too quick to take sides on this, right? To where they'll say it is 100% bad or 100% good. Most people land on the bad side, and I'll explain why. I'm caught in the middle, right? Because what you have to realize is that there's no place in these verses where the author explicitly condemns Solomon. And in fact, when you get to verse 3, it actually starts talking about Solomon loved Yahweh. And it's about to talk about some of Solomon's issues, but it doesn't reference anything about the women. We do know in the long run that women are, spoiler alert, women are going to be the thing that leads Solomon astray. And it is going to be the foreign wives that lead him astray. And the author is going to tell us that in chapter 11. And so we know that the author doesn't mind criticizing Solomon for his marriages with foreign women. But he doesn't do that here, right? And so to me, it makes me think that the author doesn't have as much of a problem with this. At the same time, given where we know this leads, this is a step in that direction, right? But I see a lot of different aspects to this here, right? Archaeologically speaking, I've been looking into biblical archaeology lately because I'm working with for my apologetics class, like trying to figure out curriculum stuff. And archaeologically speaking, whenever you examine the time period of King David, it's very evident there was a lot of warfare going on, right? Like you have cities being leveled, destroyed, rebuilt, stuff like that, right? During Solomon's time period, you don't have any of that, right? Because Solomon was living at a time of peace, right? And what does Solomon's name mean?
Peace.
Peace, right? What did David tell Solomon to do? Be a man of peace, right? And that's what Solomon's doing here, right? Solomon, from a kingly perspective, is doing the right thing. But, counterpoint, later on, we're going to realize that this is not Solomon's first wife. You want to know how I know this? Because Solomon, how long is Solomon's reign? Do you know?
40 years?
He's going to reign for 40 years. Whenever his son Rehoboam ascends the throne, Rehoboam is 41 years old. Which means that Solomon had to have had Rehoboam before he was king. Right? Which means that this could not be his first wife. Right? And so, that adds complexity to it, because apparently this is not his first wife, and God doesn't like people having multiple wives. And he makes it clear that a king's not supposed to multiply wives. But the author doesn't draw attention to that right here, even though the author would be aware of that information. right? And so what I'm just trying to highlight here is I'm trying to teach us like a nuanced approach to this, where we're not so quick to jump to conclusions based off of these other things. We just need to let the text speak for itself. And to me, I think that whenever you look at it, the author he's just saying this is what happened, right? And he's not really choosing a side. And if he is choosing a side, it actually seems to come out on the favorable end, right? So rather than looking at this in the negative side, because there are places where the Bible will explicitly say that it is sinful to make alliances with Egypt, right? Like if you go to the book of Isaiah, that is what the prophet Isaiah is getting on to the people about. He says, why did you go and make an alliance with Egypt? So the Bible's not afraid to say stuff like that. But whenever you look at it this way, there is a flip side to this, right? God told Abraham that in him all the nations of the world would be blessed. Well, Solomon is kind of helping bless the nations of the world right here, right? He is going to the Gentiles. And what we see here is that he's going to marry Pharaoh's daughter, but then it says that he still loves Yahweh. So apparently, this woman was not the one leading him astray from Yahweh, right? And so what I'm trying to point out here is that there's a lot of complexity here. And I've tried to highlight this multiple times. Solomon, like David and like Saul, has the difficulty of functioning in a role that was never meant to exist, right? There was never meant to be a king over Israel. God was supposed to be the king. God knew that the people were going to ask for a king, and so he paved the way for it and stuff. But that was never technically supposed to exist, and so they're caught between a rock and a hard place, and there's all these laws for all the people of Israel. And there's laws for the priests, and there's law for all these things. And there's only like a few verses that tell you what exactly a king is supposed to do. And so now the king is trying to figure out how to balance all the other stuff while trying to also serve the people and serve God, right? And so they're in a difficult situation. And I think that what we can even say here is that God is being gracious even amidst the failures. Because what we see before in chapter 2 is that Solomon was doing a really good job. And what we're about to see afterwards is that Solomon's doing a really good job. And so I'm just left to assume that the author is not trying to highlight something negative about Solomon here, because it would seem like a really random place to put it, right? He could easily have just saved this story for later on, whenever he's talking about it in chapter 11, and say, oh yeah, by the way, this all started whenever he married Pharaoh's daughter. But instead he puts it right here, in between two stories of Solomon being great. And so I'm left to believe that it's leaning towards a more positive thing, but at the same time, I'm aware that there's some sketchy stuff going on, right? So we read, then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had completed building his own house and the house of Yahweh and the wall around Jerusalem, right? Those are things, that's kind of foreshadowing, because we haven't gotten to those stories yet, but that's coming soon, right? The city of David is basically Jerusalem at the time period of David, right? It's much smaller than the current city of Jerusalem, right? It's actually just a tiny little sliver of land, right? So he takes her there. He basically takes her to the royal palace until he has had time to expand the city, right? And then he probably moved her into another place. The people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of Yahweh until those days. That's also another weird detail. What is it talking about there?
Is it saying that even though there's not like a temple that's being built, that the people aren't just like not following the law or God's commands? Like Solomon seems to maybe still be leading them in a religious way. Like even though we don't have a temple, like we're still going to like make sacrifices to God. Like just showing like, I guess like religiously where the people are in that moment while they're in this like period of waiting kind of.
Yeah, I think the period of waiting thing is the really thing it's kind of emphasizing here. I think it's pointing out that this was a weird time in Israel's history, right? Because we see, as a result of what King David did in the land, the people are more focused on God, right? I mean, like David led them back to the Lord. He brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, but the tabernacle is still down in another place. It's in Gibeon, where Solomon's about to go, right? And so the Ark of the Covenant's in one place, the tabernacle's in another place, but then you've got this going on where like there's the anticipation of this temple that's going to be built, but it hasn't been built yet. And we know that 2 Samuel ended with David purchasing the land where the temple will be built, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant is currently sitting at. But it's just a weird time, right? If you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, God spends multiple chapters promising that there is one day going to be a place where he chooses for his name to dwell, right? And ultimately, he's talking about Jerusalem, right? He is going to choose to have his name dwell there. That is where he's going to dwell. And he's going to dwell in the temple. But there's not a temple yet. And so what you end up seeing here is you see that the people of Israel are trying to be faithful to Yahweh, but the religion is getting a little bit polluted by the practices of the pagans, right? Because pagans are typically the ones who would go to the high places to worship, right? Because basically, a high place is just a hill, right? Whenever it says high place, it's talking about a hill. But the reason they call it a high place rather than just a hill is because of what the hill represented, right? A hill or a mountain represents the meeting place between God and man, right? Because if God dwells in the heavens and man dwells on the earth, how do you get the closest to God? Go up on a hill, right? This is what you see throughout Scripture. Like the Garden of Eden was, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but we actually learned this from in the prophets, right? The Garden of Eden was founded, it was on a hilltop, it was on a mountain, right? So it was high up, right? Moses, he goes up Mount Sinai, right? He goes up and down, up and down. When you read Exodus, every time he goes up the mountain, it represents him going to meet with God. And then he comes down to the people, up to God, down to the people, right? And so whenever you go up in Scripture, up is usually a metaphor for going to meet with God, right? That's why whenever you're going from Jerusalem, you go down to Jericho, right? You're moving away from God. But when you go up to Jerusalem, you're ascending to the place where God dwells, right? High places are associated with where you meet with the gods. And so pagans would typically make their sacrifices on whatever hill. But with God, he said you can't just make a sacrifice on any hill. You've got to make a sacrifice in the place where I choose for my name to dwell. Well, the issue is that he's chosen Jerusalem, but they don't have an official place to worship yet, right? The Ark of the Covenant's over here, the tabernacle's over there, and so what we see here is that the people are kind of confused on what to do, because they're like, we want to worship Yahweh, and so they're being faithful to him, but really their worship doesn't look that dissimilar from the pagans, because they're kind of just picking any hill to go and do it on, right? And they're like, okay, I guess we'll go to this hill, we'll go to that hill. And I don't think it's saying it as a negative thing. It's just pointing out that there's a problem that needs to be fixed, right? Right now, they are worshiping God, and that's good, but they're worshiping God kind of like the pagans do, right? Just anywhere and everywhere. Whereas God's whole thing was, no, there's going to be one place where you'll all come to worship me, right? And so basically this is laying the groundwork that there needs to be a temple built, right? Okay, now we go verses 3 through 5.
And Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what I should give to you."
Ooh, this is where it starts getting good. All right, so verse 4 and 5 really set up the main exciting part of the story. But let's talk about verse 3 real quick. Whenever the narrator chooses to describe Solomon, what is the first thing he says about him?
He loved Yahweh.
Solomon loved Yahweh, right? It doesn't simply say Solomon obeyed the commands of Yahweh and stuff like that. It does, like, that it immediately follows up with that. I just love that the first thing it says is that he loved Yahweh, right? That implies that there is a relationship there, right? It's not simply he walked through the motions. No, he loved Yahweh, right? This is who Solomon was. He loved Yahweh, walking in the statutes of his father David, right? He did what his dad commanded, right? Because how does the Bible describe David?
Man after God's own heart.
Man after God's own heart, right? David was a man after God's own heart, and Solomon, he walked in the footsteps of David, right? What David commanded, Solomon did. Why? Well, because he loved his father, but more than he loved his earthly father, he loved the Father in heaven, right? He loved Yahweh, right? And because he loved Yahweh, it was no problem for him to walk in David's commandments, because this is what he wanted to do because he loved Yahweh. I think that's great, right? I would love if that's how our story started, right? Where somebody's like telling our story and it says, and Benjamin loved God. Good, yes. That's what you want to hear, right? But then there's one word that you don't want to hear after it says that. And Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Darn. Okay, but what's it saying?
He sacrificed on high places, which you would think is good, but it sounds like it's bad.
Well, this is one of those places where, once again, I think what we're really seeing here is that there's some problems that are coming to the forefront, right? I think some people will overread into this, and they'll think that it's saying that he's like offering sacrifices to other gods or something on the high places. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think that it's pointing out that Solomon was entirely obedient to everything David said, but there was one place where he was falling short, right? And it was the fact that he hadn't yet built the place for God, right? Because if you remember, this was David's whole thing, right? I mean, David was like established in Jerusalem, and he's like, God, I want to build a house for you. And God said, you're not going to be the one who builds a house for me. Your son will build a house for me. And so it seems like maybe the author's suggesting Solomon's first order of business should have been, let's get to building the house. Because if you actually go read in 1 Chronicles, you read that David, whenever God told him he couldn't build the house, David took that command as strictly as possible, in the sense of, he said, okay, I won't build the house, but I will gather the materials and I will draw out the blueprints. Right? So literally the only thing David did not do was lay the foundation and get building. Right? So he didn't start construction. Right? But if you go read Chronicles, you'll see that David got all the materials and he got the designs and all that stuff ready. Right? And so really all Solomon had to do was build on top of the place. Right? He had to lay the foundation and just have it built. Right? And Solomon's going to do that very shortly. Right? That's really the majority of Solomon's reign is going to, whenever we read about it, it's going to be dedicated to talking about him building the temple. Because it's a huge deal. Right? But I think that's what it's probably really highlighting here. Right? He loved Yahweh, he really did, and he walked in the commandments of David, but he was seemingly kind of satisfied with just going and building, offering sacrifices on high places, which is kind of problematic because he's supposed to build a house for God, right? That's the one place where it's like, if there was one place he could improve, right? Constructive criticism. The one place he should have recognized that there was an issue there, right? And I'm not saying this began with Solomon. I think that this was probably an issue during David's time as well. The difference is that David's life was a life of war, right? And so David really didn't have time to focus on stuff like this, and that's why God told him, you can't build the temple. He said, your hands are too bloody, right? You have shed too much blood to build a house for my name. Your son will live in a time of peace, and therefore he should be the one to build a house for my name, right? That was the whole reason why. And so, this really becomes an issue when Solomon's on the throne. Because now there's a time of peace, and now that there's a time of peace, the first order of business should be, let's build a house for God. Right? Let's at least bring the tabernacle here so we can have one set place. But as it currently stands, there's the ark over here, there's a tabernacle in another place, and for some reason the altar is somewhere in Jerusalem. Right? And so there's just confusion over what the people are supposed to do, and Solomon's kind of contributing to that confusion by also just going from one high place to another, right? So they're kind of treating it like they're intermixing pagan practices with worship of God. And that doesn't mean they're turning to idolatry. It just means that their worship looks a little bit more worldly than it should, right? Which I think sometimes we're guilty of as well, right?
I have a question.
Yes.
So whenever I originally read it, I was thinking that, in the last chapter, it talked about how Abiathar was banished, and so it was saying that because he was the priest.
Yes.
And I was thinking that it meant that Solomon had good intentions, but it was him that was physically giving the sacrifices whenever he shouldn't, because he's not in the priest line. Is there someone who is the priest right now, or it never said?
Zadok.
Zadok. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, got
Yeah.
it.
So he did appoint Zadok to be the high priest, and in addition to Zadok, there are other Levitical priests, right? So it's not like Zadok. Zadok's the only one who would be able to go into the Holy of Holies stuff. because he's the high priest. But there are other priests at this time period who could be functioning in this. And so I don't think it's suggesting that Solomon did, like, he was offering the sacrifices himself, mainly because he'd get called out for that 100%. Right? Like, that, because that was like a huge deal whenever Saul did that.
Yeah.
Right? Because that is very presumptuous. Right? To where what we see, it's actually very interesting. We'll talk about this again later on, is that the king, once again, he's in a really weird place to where he is like a sacred figure and he does represent something from a religious perspective, but he's still not a priest, right? Like he tiptoes very close to being a priest, but he's still not a priest, right? And it's very weird. But yeah, so I don't think that it's suggesting that Solomon actually offered the sacrifices. And so Solomon, he offered these sacrifices on the high places, and it just so happens that he went to Gibeon, where presumably the tabernacle was at this time period, and he goes there to offer sacrifices, right? And apparently God wasn't like hardcore judging him for what he was doing here, because it's during this moment when God's going to show up to him and offer him this amazing thing. So the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. The reason it was the great high place is because that's where the tabernacle was at. And I believe we learned the tabernacle was there from 1 Chronicles, right? So that's where I'm getting that information. It doesn't actually tell us that in Samuel or Kings. So the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there. This is not that far away from Jerusalem. For that was the great high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar.
Wow.
What does that suggest?
That went on for a while.
It probably went on for a long while. And what else does it suggest about Solomon?
He loves Yahweh.
He loved Yahweh, right? Is there any place in the law where it says you need to offer 1,000 sacrifices? No. He's going above and beyond. And it tells you that Solomon seems to be doing pretty well. The kingdom seems to be doing just fine right now, right? It tells you that even before this whole interaction with God, it seems like Solomon inherited a pretty good kingdom, right? David left him on good terms, right? It's not like Solomon had to build much. Solomon literally is dwelling at a time of peace. So he receives a healthy kingdom from his father David, and all he has to do is build upon that, right? He's turning the kingdom into an empire, right? And so he's a rich dude. He's got this, and he's like, I want to give all this to God. 1,000 sacrifices. That's crazy. But it's because Solomon loved Yahweh, right? And so yes, he might be going and doing this at the place where he doesn't really need to be doing it, but he's still got the right heart behind it. And that's really what God's paying attention to, right? Because yes, he might not be doing everything perfect, but that's okay, right? God can work through that, right? The main thing is that his heart is in the same place that his father David's was, right? He was a man after God's own heart, right? For now, right? Unfortunately, Solomon's story will not end that way. So Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar, and in Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. This is always exciting, right? This feels like we're back in Genesis, right? Because back in Genesis, there's a lot of really cool moments where people go into deep sleeps, right? Real quick, remember what you wanted to say. Don't forget. What are some moments in Genesis where somebody goes into a deep sleep?
Abraham.
Yes?
Isaac.
All right.
The stairs to heaven.
Oh, then Jacob. That's Jacob.
Yeah, that's-
Jacob. So Jacob, yeah, he has this dream. Remember, he's laying his head on a rock, and he has this dream of a stairway to heaven, right? Really cool story. And God communicates something to him about blessings that he will bestow upon him. Who else?
Joseph has 2 dreams.
Joseph has a bunch of dreams where God communicates something about a blessing that he will receive. Who else?
Didn't Abraham have a dream?
Abraham had a dream, right? And that's where God communicated a blessing that he would receive, right? And who was the very first person who went into a deep sleep?
Adam.
Adam. He went to sleep alone, and when he woke up, he had a wife, right? Right here, Solomon's going to go to sleep, and he's going to wake up, and he's going to be married to Lady Wisdom, right? And I say Lady Wisdom, if you go to the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified as a woman, right? And so, really, wisdom is it's the true spouse that Solomon really needed. He's going to have all these other ones, but wisdom is the true spouse that really stuck with him the whole way, right? Okay, what were you going to say, Rocky?
That was it. The story.
Oh, okay, cool. So in Gibeon, Yahweh appears to Solomon in a dream at night. feels like you're jumping back into Genesis. You're like, oh, okay, this is good stuff. So God shows up to Solomon in a dream. And this is cool. God said, ask what I should give to you. So what does he basically say to him?
I will give you anything you want.
Yeah, I'll give you anything you want. Ask and it'll be yours. Now, who would not want to have this experience? This is awesome, right? I mean, this is cool. Like, imagine, like, first off, this is not like it'd be one thing if I walked up to Sean and I was like, hey, Sean, is there anything I can do for you? Okay, well, I'm limited, right? Because if Sean's going to ask something from me, he has to realize I work at a private school, so I don't make a bunch of money, right? Also, I'm just a 26-year-old dude, so it's not like there's a lot I can offer him, right? So if he's going to ask anything of me, it has to be like barred by it has to be restricted by the constraints of my own limitations, right? God is the uncreated first cause who is all-powerful, all-knowing, in charge of all things. And Solomon just so happens to be the most important person on the face of the planet at this point because he is the king over God's people. This is like an amazing opportunity, right? Ask anything and I'll give it to you.
It's kind of scary a little bit.
Well, it is a scary
Yes.
thought, right? Because most people, what would they probably ask for, right? This is like the whole, whenever the genie comes out of the lamp, like it's almost like that, right? You have 3 wishes. And there's so many stories about stuff like this because usually, or let me rephrase this. Usually, whenever you hear stories like this, what is the purpose of the story?
Well, usually it's people that are asking for things that will like personally benefit them, but they're like really small things, and then they end up like turning their wishes into something like really weird.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, I don't know, I guess about like doing things that are not just like for your own benefit.
Well, usually the purpose of stories like that, whenever you have like a genie from a lamp and stuff like that, usually the purpose of the story is to highlight the character of the person who rubs the lamp. Right? That's usually the purpose of the story. Right? Because the question is, whenever you have unlimited possibilities, what do you ask for? Right? Anybody in here ever watched Fairly Odd Parents? You remember that cartoon?
Yes.
Yes. That was like the message of every episode. Right? Timmy has these Fairly Odd Parents who can grant his wishes, and almost every episode he had to learn a lesson because he would ask for something he shouldn't have asked for. Right? And so you learn something about Timmy's character. I know this is a cartoon for kids, but it was meant to teach you lessons. Right? To teach you to not be selfish and stuff like that. And that's because this is a scary question. Because most people would ask for horrible, terrifying things. They would ask for all the power in the world. They would ask for all the riches in the world. They would ask for all the women in the world. And so the question becomes, what will Solomon ask for? Because the way that Solomon answers this will tell us about his heart. Right? Even David didn't get asked this question. Right? David didn't get asked this. There's not another character in Scripture I can think of who got asked this. It's just Solomon. Right? God is testing Solomon's heart to see what he is made of. And this is how Solomon responds. Go for it, Sean.
Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your slave David my father, according to how he walked before you in truth and righteousness, and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is to this day. So now, O Yahweh my God, you have made your slave king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in, and your slave is in the midst of your people which you have chosen, a numerous people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So give your slave a listening heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this glorious people of yours?"
This is how you give the perfect answer in a test.
Yep.
Right? What I love here is that Solomon is ultimately asking for wisdom. But the way that he asks for wisdom shows that he already has a lot of wisdom. This is so cool. I love everything about Solomon's response here. Were you going to say something?
I love how it says your slave king.
Yes.
He's a slave to God.
Yes. He's like, I'm king, but I'm your slave.
Yeah.
It's great. It's fantastic. Let's just walk through it. Then Solomon said, right? Okay, let me start with this. Sorry, I get so excited about this. Okay. Whenever somebody asks you, what do you want from me? Right? Ask for anything and I'll give it to you. Every single person's heart would be naturally tempted to abuse that request. Because that's how we are, right? We're selfish people by nature. And if somebody gives us an inch, we take a mile. Right? Hey, I'll give you whatever you want. What do you want? I mean, think about this. There's a similar story to this in the New Testament. Whenever Herod Antipas turns to his little niece and says, after she does this like dance for him, ask for anything and I'll give it to you. And he's probably just like being like, I don't know, like, do you want like a extra candy bar or something? And then she goes and talks with her mom, and the mom says, ask for the head of John the Baptist.
Oh.
Ouch.
Well, Herod Antipas wasn't expecting that. He was expecting something a little bit less than that.
Oh.
But now he can't back down, right? Because he made a promise, right? So that's a very similar thing, right? But people abuse it, right? You ask them, hey, what do you want? I'll give you whatever. And people will abuse that. That's our natural temptation. But Solomon doesn't do that. Rather than abusing God's graciousness, instead what he does is he voices his gratitude for God's graciousness. And that's what reels him in. Then Solomon said, you have shown great chesed to your slave David, my father, according to how he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great chesed, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. First off, I love that it's all about hesed, right? Because of course it is, yes?
He doesn't give a direct answer either. He kind of explains himself before he gives an answer.
Well, yeah, so I do like that, right? He doesn't immediately jump to the answer. He's reasoning his way to his answer. He's basically saying, well, I can't ask for much because you've already given so much. Yes?
He gives gratitude to God first.
Absolutely. Right? God's like, what do you want? I'll give it to you. And he says, but you've already given so much. Right? You have already shown hesed to your slave David. Right? David, like my father, he was a king, but he was nothing. Right? He was a shepherd boy. And you showed him hesed again and again and again. And David knew this. Remember? This is why David showed so much hesed to other people, because he knew God's hesed. Right? You've shown hesed to your slave David, my father, according to how he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward you. Right? He highlights David's heart. He understands the story, right? Solomon gets it. He says, you showed so much compassion and loving kindness to my father because he responded well to you in his heart. And as a result, you kept that hesed even after his death. Because now that David is dead and gone, you are still showing him hesed because you have placed me on the throne. Right? You have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is to this day. He says, God, you are offering me so much. But even right now, I'm still receiving the gifts that you gave to my father. I'm like, how could I possibly ask something from you whenever, like, my very throne is a result of the gifts that are still overflowing from my father, right? Whenever David prayed in Psalm, like said in Psalm 23, my cup overflows, he wasn't kidding. That's what Solomon's saying. He said, you filled up my dad's cup so much that it overflowed into my reign. I'm still experiencing it. The fact that I'm on the throne right now is because you showed so much hesed to my father David. And you have to remember that hesed is all about gifts, right? It's about whenever you can't, you have no right to expect something from anybody, yet they give you everything, right? It is an unbelievable gift. And that's what Solomon says. He's like, you've already given so much to my father, and now you're wanting to offer something to me? And you have the audacity to make it whatever I asked for? What could I possibly ask for? I haven't even asked for anything. I was literally born into the throne. Like, he's like, I literally, by being born, you already made me the most important person on the face of the planet. Like, what more could I ask for? I am the chosen seed of my father David, and I was born as a result of his sin. Right? Like, this is crazy. Like, he's like, what could I ask for? Like, you've already given me everything. He grew up with a silver spoon. Right? David grew up in a hard life. Right? David was a shepherd boy neglected by his family. David, he was a warrior. David was a fugitive. He had a hard life. Solomon grew up in a palace. He lived this easy life, and he didn't even have to do anything to become king. His mom and the prophet did everything for him. All he had to do was ride a donkey and get the crown put on his head. He says, I've done nothing to earn this. Right? All you've done is give, and now you're wanting to give more? Once again, it sounds a lot like Genesis. Right? This is how Abraham and Isaac and Jacob responded. Well, not so much Jacob. Jacob he's a different character. So now, he's like thinking about this, and he's just like voicing his thoughts to God. So now, O Yahweh my God, you have made your slave king in place of my father David. I love that transition, right? Who was the slave at the beginning? David. Who's the slave now? Solomon. Right? He's voicing his commitment to God. Right? David, my father, was your slave. And now I'm your slave. And you've made your slave king. This is how kings should view things. Right? Kings should not be lording it over other people. That's what Jesus will talk about. Right? The greatest amongst you should be the servant of all. That's how Solomon views himself. You have made your slave king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I don't know how to go out or come in. He says, the only thing I'm lacking right now is I don't know what the heck I'm doing. Right? Like, you've given me everything else. You've already given me wealth. You've already given me power. You've already given me the kingdom of my father David. The only thing that I lack is I'm just a kid who doesn't know what he's doing. Right? My dad, he learned the hard way how to be a king. Right? For me, I grew up in a palace with a silver spoon. Right? I've never been in want of anything in my life. I didn't have to be a fugitive. I didn't have to take care of people in the caves of Adullam. I didn't have to run for my life. I didn't have to fight in battles. All I did was exist. And now I'm here on the throne. So if there's anything I lack, it's the fact that I don't have the people skills. I don't have the governmental skills that my dad had. My dad was a people person who grew, he was such a good leader because he came from the people, right? He knew how to go out and come in, right? Because he was the man of the people. For me, I'm just a prince, right? And I'm a young boy. I'm 20 years old, maybe younger, right? I'm just a kid. I have no idea what I'm doing. And your slave is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a numerous people who are too many to be numbered or counted. He's like, this is a lot of people, right? And David, the good thing for David is that he did really well whenever things were tough, right? Because David was just a type of guy where whenever things got tough, he just knew how to take control and order things out. And so David was a really good king in a time of war. But now here Solomon is, and everything's prospering. And just think about it. Whenever things prosper, it's actually harder to govern the people because y'all aren't going to be as unified because now all of a sudden people start getting, they want this, they want that, they're distracted by this. They start wanting all these different things. And he says, I saw my dad lead people through all this other stuff, but now we're in this time of peace where there's all these people and there's just me and I'm a kid and I don't know what I'm doing. And keep in mind, this is a pretty humble thing because so far he's been doing a pretty good job. But I think this is what he's genuinely feeling. Your slaves in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a numerous people who are too many to be numbered or counted. So if I had a request, give your slave a listening heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. I love that. A listening heart, right? A hearing heart, Shema, right? Give your slave a heart that hears, right? It hears your voice. It hears the people's voice. It knows how to listen, right? What is the most important command that you have in the entire law? Hear. Shema Yisrael, right? Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, right? Hear, O Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Solomon says, that's what I want. I want a heart that hears. That's a beautiful way to talk about wisdom, right? He doesn't just say wisdom. He says, I want a heart that hears. Right? I want a heart that is in tune with you, in tune with the world around me, a heart that is able to hear and discern and decipher all the things around me and figure out how to actually lead. Give your slave a listening heart to judge your people, right? And by judge, it means not I'm judging you, looking down on you. It's saying to govern, right? To take care of them. and to discern between good and evil. When you hear the phrase discern between good and evil, what does that immediately make you think of?
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? Whenever you read in Genesis, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is that something that man was supposed to possess?
Nope.
Well, no. That was something reserved for God. And what did Adam and Eve do? They chose to take it for themselves. I think Solomon's approach is a lot better. Rather than taking it for himself, he's saying, God, we live in this world where everybody has already taken from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so if I'm to rule these people, could you give me a heart that can discern those things? So rather than me taking of the tree of my own accord, will you teach me how you view the knowledge of good and evil? Right? Tell me what you view as good. Tell me what you view as evil. So that whenever I judge the people, I'm not judging according to my own limited wisdom. I'm judging according to your wisdom. Right? I don't want to eat from the forbidden tree. I want to eat from the tree that you have given me. Right? Give me the fruit. Like basically produce the same result, but make it so that my discernment is not from my own judgment, it's from yours. Right? Because Eve looked at the fruit that God said was bad, and she called it good. Because she thought that she had the knowledge of good and evil. Right? And that's what we do every time we sin. Right? God calls something good, we call it evil. God calls something evil, we call it good. That is why we sin. And Solomon says, I don't want that. I want a hearing heart. Right? So I can judge the people. And if I'm going to judge the people, I need to discern between good and evil. Right? But I don't want to take that fruit myself. I'm asking you to give it to me. Right? So that I can lead these people well. That's beautiful. Like, this is some great stuff. For who is able to judge this glorious people of yours? I love that you can tell that he recognizes the importance of the task before him. Right? I mean, I wouldn't immediately look at the people of Israel and call them a glorious people. Right? But you can see that because Solomon loves Yahweh, he loves the people of Yahweh. Even if they are a stubborn people. I don't think many people would call them glorious, but Solomon does. He says, who can judge this glorious people of yours? Like, what man in his right mind thinks that he can rightly preside over the people of God? That's way too big of a task. Because ultimately, who was supposed to be the king? God. Right? And the reason why God was supposed to be the king is because it's too big of a task for anybody other than God. And that's what Solomon acknowledges. He says, hey, God, this job that I have was never meant to exist. It is too big for me. Remember when Moses was trying to do it? That's what Jethro told him. Remember Jethro, his father-in-law, came up to him because Moses was literally up all day and night trying to judge the people. And there were too many of them. And that was just whenever they were a band of people just wandering through the wilderness. Now they're a whole nation. And Jethro had to tell Moses, he's like, hey man, this is too big for you. You got to appoint other people to take care of this. This is too mighty a task for you. It's too heavy for you. And Solomon's like, well, crud, we're not just wandering through the wilderness now. We're a whole nation. And we're a prospering nation. It's just going to get bigger. He says, God, I can't do this on my own. And so if I had one request of you, give me wisdom. Give me a hearing heart. Help me judge the people. Teach me how you define good, how you define evil, so that when I judge these people, I can do what is right. Not in their eyes, but in your eyes. That's what I want. Because that's the one thing I'm lacking. I've got all the other stuff. I don't need money. I've already got money. I don't need power. I've already got power. The thing I need is you. Because you're the only one fit for the job. Quite fittingly, ultimately, Solomon right here is reflecting the greater son of David. Right? Because the greater son of David is going to be the ultimate king who can judge God's glorious people. And the reason why is because he's not just man. He is God. Right? And so he is actually the one who is fit to judge the people. And so there is an answer to Solomon's question here. It's supposed to be a rhetorical question, but there is an answer. For who is able to judge this glorious people of yours? Jesus. Right? Jesus is able to do that. Right? The greater son of David. And so Jesus is the answer to Solomon's question here. Solomon recognizes his own limitations, and Jesus is the answer to those limitations. Now let's see how God responds. Just read verses 10 to 14.
Okay. And it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for yourself long life, nor have asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but you have asked for yourself discernment to listen to justice. Behold, I have done according to your words. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. Now, if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments, as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days.
This is good stuff. God is cool. Solomon's cool. This is just a great story. Yes.
He asks for wisdom, but then God gives him wisdom, but he also gives him more than what he asks for.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, that right there, what does that tell you about how God views Solomon's response?
He likes his response.
He likes
Great
it.
response.
Yeah. So he's like, that was an amazing response.
Here's more.
Right? Because it tells you a lot about Solomon's character. Right? Because so many other people, right? If, like, right now, if God were to show up to me and ask me, like, what, like, if I could have anything, what would I want? I don't even know what I'd ask. I'd probably be like, could I have thick hair again? I have no idea. Right? It'd probably be something severely selfish. I'd probably be like, God, take away my aching joints and just make me healthy again. It would be self-seeking. Right? Whereas Solomon's request was not self-seeking at all. It was literally like, I've already got enough. Just help me, like, fulfill the job you've given me. That's a beautiful response. Yes?
Solomon's response to God really shows how much he loves God. So God's like, here you go. Here's some more. Because you love me so much. I'm going to love you even more.
Yeah. Which is exactly like a parent would do.
Yeah.
Right? And if you remember back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, whenever God made his covenant to David, he said, I will be as a father to your son. That's exactly what you do. Right? If a father goes to his kid and says, hey, what do you want? And the kid's like, I want $1 million. That's like, okay, you're not getting $1 million. But if he's like, what do you want? And he's like, well, Dad, I don't know. There's this girl I really like, and I like to just like take her out for a meal. Well, the dad's gonna be like, okay, son, and you know what? Here's $100. Because if he likes the response, he'll give more. Right? Because he's gracious and loving, and he loves the son, and he wants to support him. Right? That's what God's doing here. Right? He says, wow, great answer. Right? You could have asked for anything. And God was testing him, but I think God would have given him whatever. Right? Solomon just gave a good response. Right? And so God said, that's the type of guy I'm looking for. Perfect. And it was pleasing. It was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. That's great. Right? That's what we should want with our lives. Right? Where we ask for, like, whenever we talk to God, or whenever we pray, right? Whenever we pray to God and we ask him something, like ask something of him, that it would be pleasing to him. Right? Where he hears that prayer and he's not saying, well, that was a selfish prayer. He hears it and says, I'm glad they asked. Right? That's what we should want. It is pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. And God said to him, because you've asked this thing and have not asked for yourself a long life, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have you asked for the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself discernment to listen to justice. Right? You see what God expected most people would ask for. Right? They would either ask, God, give me a long life, or God, give me money, or God, kill my enemies. He didn't ask for any of those. If he had, God probably would have given him those. But that's probably all he would have given him. But instead he says, I love that you didn't ask for any of those. Instead, what you asked for is discernment to hear justice, to listen. Behold, I have done according to your words. I love he says, I have done. It implies it's already been finished. Like he's like, I knew you were going to ask for, so I already did it. So it's almost like you can go back to chapters 1, 2, and 3, and you can read this into that and realize that that wisdom that we saw Solomon already exercising, that was actually part of the gift. So it's like, we're like, man, Solomon's already a pretty wise guy. Well, yeah. So God showed up to him in the dream right here. But that doesn't mean that God was restricted to only giving him the gift after the dream. It's like, well, yeah. Have you noticed that, like, some of the decisions you made have been pretty good? You're welcome. I knew you'd ask, so I already gave it to you. Right? He says, yeah, I've already done it. Yeah, like, I knew you were going to ask for that, but I wanted to hear you say it. Right? That's ultimately how prayer works also. right? Like whenever we pray to God, we're not praying because we're giving him new information. It's because we love him and we want to talk with him and we want to communicate with him and he wants to communicate with us, right? But we have to realize, like, he already knows what we're going to say, right? Whenever I pray and say, like at the beginning of Bible study, whenever I say, God, may your spirit be present with us. Well, it's not like he was like, oh, crud, I'm so glad they asked. I almost forgot. Well, he knows that we want his spirit to be present with us, right? He knows that. But he still wants us to vocalize it, right? Because it's important for us to do that. So he's like, yeah, I've done that. I have done according to your words. Maybe he's talking about previously, but for sure he's talking about going forward. It's done. Boom. Right? No waiting. Right? He's not going to have to wait 25 years like Abraham did. Right? He said, it's done. There you go. Immediate, like, it's like an Amazon delivery. Right? It's already at your door. There you go. Behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. Solomon, you're going to be the wisest man on earth. There's never been somebody like you before. There's never going to be somebody like you afterwards. This is going to make it all the more heartbreaking whenever we see the end of Solomon's story, because we see that apparently possessing wisdom and possessing a listening heart is not enough to stay faithful to God. There's got to be something else. That's the heartbreaking part. I hate to bring that up right here because that's not the focus. I just want to keep that in mind, that this is some high praise. He says, Solomon, you're going to be unmatched when it comes to wisdom. Right? The only person who's going to even come close is going to be when Jesus shows up, and Jesus is going to be wiser. But he's saying, in the foreseeable future, nobody. Right? You are going to be known for your wisdom. And we're going to see that in the coming chapters. I have also, just because this is who God is, but wait, there's more. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. You didn't ask for riches, but I threw it in there. You didn't ask for honor, but I threw it in there. Also, I love how God can just like hand this stuff out. Right? It's like for us nowadays, like think about it. Like if I wanted riches, I would have to work my butt off day after day. I'd have to get like 1 million different jobs. And God's like, oh yeah, here's some riches, by the way. Like God, like 'cause he has everything, right? He's all powerful. Like everything in the world is his, right? But I don't want you to think that the way this worked out is that when Solomon woke up, all of a sudden like his treasuries were just filled with gold. Whenever Solomon gets the money, it's not like he just magically poof showed up. It probably looked like it was showing up according to human means. But as it's flowing in, he recognizes that these are gifts from God. Right? So I just want us to realize that God works through like human things, right? It's not like in order for God to do something, it has to just like poof, magically happen. Right? So he says, I'll give you both riches and honor, so there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. Right? You're going to be unmatched, not only in wisdom, forever, but during your days, also in riches and honor. You're going to be the richest and most powerful and most well-respected man during your lifetime. That's crazy.
I feel like this story is like the conversation that Solomon and God have is very similar to like 2 Samuel whenever it was David and God having a conversation about him saying that he wanted to build a house for God. And he said like, thanks for the offer, but like your son's going to build the house, but you're going to have like an eternal dynasty, like with your name. I feel like it's like, those are like parallel, kind of like what's going on.
I think it's intentionally supposed to be. Mainly because God said there, I will be as a father to your son. Mm-hmm. And now here we have David's son, and God's acting like a father to him. Mm-hmm. And so I think the parallels are supposed to be clear, because you've got David saying, wow, look at the hesed God has shown me. Mm-hmm. What can I do in return? I want to build a house for you. Right? And so I think that those parallels are definitely supposed to be there for sure. I've also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. But then there's a clarifier at the end. Now, if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commands as your father David walked, then I will prolong your days. If. Right? So the other things, right? Because he says, you didn't ask for riches or honor, but I'm going to give you those. You also didn't ask for a lengthy life, and I will give you that. But for that one, I need you to keep obeying me. And I think the reason why God says this is because he knows with great power comes great responsibility, and with great prosperity comes great temptation. Right? He says, Solomon, I am going to make you the wisest and most powerful and richest man in the foreseeable future. That's dangerous. Right? Because that means, but like, think about it, right? This is our greatest struggle nowadays, right? Whenever David was on the run, that's when he was most faithful to God. Whenever David had times of peace, that's whenever he strayed. Same thing with us, right? The church has always thrived under persecution. In the current American church, the reason we struggle so much is because we have it so good, to where people don't even focus on God because we're so distracted by the things of the world. Solomon is about to have that 10 times greater than we do, right? He's about to be the richest and wisest and most powerful and well-respected man in the world. And that means that temptation is going to be jumping at him from every angle. And therefore, when it comes to a long life, God says, I need to make a clarification. With this one, I need you to keep your eyes on me. Right? I don't want to just give you a long life free of charge. You got to stay faithful. Right? Because he's like, dude, what I'm giving you right now, it's going to test you like nobody else has been tested. And so we have to have sympathy towards Solomon, because you've got to realize that because this guy is receiving all these things, he is probably going to be facing the most temptation more than any other person on the face of the planet thus far. Right? He is going to be at the height of prosperity. And whenever you're so high up there, it's very easy to look down at all you've got and forget to look back up. Right? That's usually what ends up happening. Whereas whenever you're at the bottom, all you can do is look up to God. Right? Whereas he's going to be standing on a pile of all the things God's given him. And he's going to look down. Right? And so we have to have some sympathy there. We got to realize this dude's going to go through it, and God seems aware of that. So he says, Solomon, you need to keep your eyes on me. You need to keep walking after me. Right now, you say you love me. Keep loving me. Right? Don't lose sight of me. Verse 15.
Then Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and offered burnt offerings and made peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants.
That must have been a funny moment. He just like woke up. He's like, that was wild. It's like, everybody's like, Solomon, what's up? He's like, I just had the weirdest dream in the world. And if I'm right, things are about to change around here. That was wild. Right? So Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. He's like, that was totally wicked. That was crazy. And he came to Jerusalem, and he stood before the Ark of the Covenant, right? He immediately goes back. He leaves Gibeon, goes back to the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God. He goes to the Ark of the Covenant, and he offers burnt offerings, and made peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants. Right? He celebrates, and he feeds his servants. Right? That's cool. I love that little detail. He makes a feast for his servants. That's a good king. Right? He's not just making a feast for the nobility. He makes a feast for his servants. He's like over here worshiping God, and he says, you know what? Make some food for those guys. They need to get some food. I just love that. That's great. All right, we move on. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get to see an example of Solomon's wisdom, and this is also a very famous story. Right? Very, very cool story where we can see how Solomon handles this. Go for it.
Then 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And the one woman said, O my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. And it happened on the 3rd day after I gave birth that this woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid her in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, he was not my son whom I had born. Then the other woman said, No, for the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son. But the first woman said, No, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king.
All right. Now, this is a complicated scenario. Right? This is a very difficult situation. What do we see happening here?
an accident happens while two women are in bed, and one of their kids dies while the other one is still alive, and one woman tries to convince the King Solomon that the dead son is the other woman's, when in fact it's hers, and that the alive son is vice versa.
Yeah. So, we basically just get to see Solomon being put in a tricky situation where honestly it does not seem like there is a clear answer to how to figure this out. Right? And if you know where the story's heading, you know where it's like, you know how Solomon's going to do this. But if, like, there's a reason I put the next part on the next slide. Because if you just look at it right here, this seems nearly impossible to solve. Right? Like, it's really just two people arguing against one another, and there's no witnesses, nothing like that. You're like, how do you handle this? So let's walk through it. Then two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. Let's just start there. This lets you know right off the bat, Solomon is a great king. Why would I say he's a great king?
Because he's letting two harlots go in front of him and is giving them the time of day to speak to them.
Yeah. I mean, not every king would I hate to say waste their time, but that's how they view it. Right? Wasting their time on just two prostitutes coming forward to share their problems.
Mm-hmm.
Like most kings, I mean, think about whenever Moses was dealing with his thing, the whole thing whenever his father-in-law came to him, he was saying, hey, there's too many things for you to have to deal with. Only let the most severe situations come to you. Right? Here Solomon's talking, it's just like two prostitutes in the land. Right? Like, it's not like prostitutes were highly esteemed. Well, no, these are women of the night, right? The oldest profession in the world, right? These are just people who sold their bodies in order to make a living, for various different reasons, right? It's not like they were highly respected people, yet he's willing to allow them to come and stand before him. That's pretty cool, right? It shows you that Solomon cared for everybody, right? He didn't care about your social status and stuff. He just I want to hear it, because this is a problem that would, a normal judge could not handle this. Right? This is a very difficult situation. And apparently Solomon's still it's important enough to bring it up. Right? So two women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. Right? There's the two women. They're standing before Solomon. He's sitting on his throne. I don't know why. I always picture Solomon having this amazing, majestic beard. I think it's because he's usually depicted like that in art. He's got this crazy long beard. He's just standing there royally on his gold-plated throne. I have no idea. And the one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house." All right, paint the picture for me. What's going on?
Two prostitutes living in one house with both of their children.
Yeah, most likely this would be probably like a brothel, right?
Probably.
It's probably where a bunch of the prostitutes were at, and they are two of the prostitutes in this house, right? Did they have official things called brothels back then? I have no idea. Right, but that's basically what it's functioning as. Right, there's two prostitutes. They're living in the same house, and this woman gives birth to a child while they're living in the house. Right, and it happened on the third day after I gave birth. This woman also gave birth to a child, and we were together. Right, so children are born 3 days apart. Right, they're around the same age. Right, both women were pregnant, probably impregnated. There's probably not a father in the picture because most likely they were impregnated by one of their visitors. Right? Two of the visitors. Right? And so both of them got pregnant around the same time. They gave birth around the same time. They're living in the same house. They both got 2 children. Okay, so there's this weird little parallel here. And we were together. There was no stranger with us in the house, only the 2 of us in the house. Apparently they had not gone back to business. Right? Apparently it was just them in the house. Right? This also would make sense because according to the law, this is probably they're still in their unclean period. Right? And so it's just them in the house. Right? Just the 2 of them and the 2 babies. Why is that important?
There's no witnesses.
There's no witnesses who can testify to who's in the right here. Right? And according to the law, how many witnesses does it need to be in order to establish a matter of truth?
Is it 2 to 3?
2 or 3. Right? On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses will a matter be established. Well, can't do that. It's well, there goes that. That would be a lot easier. right? If there were like 2 or 3 witnesses and they're all saying, okay, it's this person or this person, that would help. There's no witnesses, right? It was just the 2 of us, and that's what this person's saying. There were just the 2 of us and the babies. Yikes. There was no stranger with us in the house, only 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So do you think she laid on him on purpose?
No, it's probably not accident.
No, most likely what happened.
She was sleeping and she probably rolled over.
Yeah. So this is a thing that in a lot of cultures they still do this to this day, to where like it's supposed to be like a bonding thing between like the mother and the child, where they will sleep with like the baby in their arms or something like that. Most pediatricians would highly suggest you don't do this,
Yep.
Yes.
and the reason why is because of stuff like this, because this stuff happens, right? You roll over, and babies cannot like at this age they cannot like handle that, right? I mean, even if they're a lot older, like depending on how you roll over on them, I mean, you could smother them or something like that, right? But like I'm just being honest, like this, it's not healthy, right? But a lot of cultures, even to this day, they'll do this because it's something about how they view like the bonding between a mother and a child, right? And so they both went to bed, and they're both laying there with their kids. And one girl, she apparently, well, according to the testimony of this woman, right, she rolled over onto this child and she accidentally killed the child. Heartbreaking, right? That's sad, right? This poor child, we don't know the child's name, but he died, right? He was just innocent, being held by his mother. She rolled over in the middle of the night, accidentally killed her kid. That's sad, right? No matter what, it's a heartbreaking scenario. But then it's going to get even worse. This woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. This is,
That's just complicated.
well, it's very complicated, right? Like it's heartbreaking, but also kind of twisted and gross,
Yeah.
right? Because basically, what this woman's suggesting, and once again, I can't make a judgment yet because we haven't decided who's correct, but according to her testimony, what happened is that this woman rolled over and she accidentally killed her kid. Apparently something in the middle of the night woke her, and she saw that her child was dead, and she probably grieved, and she was like, oh no, what have I done? And maybe she had grown so attached to the idea of motherhood that even though her child was dead, she couldn't bear the thought of not being a mother. And so she got up in the middle of the night, and she walked over to the other woman's bed and switched the babies, right? And this wasn't because she inherently had, like most likely, I'm assuming it's not because she had anything against the other woman, it's because she couldn't bear the thought of not having a child anymore, right? And at this point, she's so desperate for a child that she'll do whatever it takes, even if it means making the other girl think that her child's dead and she keeps her own child, right? So that's the picture that's being presented here. And it's heartbreaking, it's twisted, it's weird, it's not good, right? So she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your maidservant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead son in my bosom. Right? So that obviously, if this is true, that is very sinful, right? I mean, like accidentally rolling onto your kid, that I don't think you can say that's inherently sinful. That was just a stupid, like, you probably just shouldn't have been laying with the kid. I don't know what the ulterior would have been, like, I don't know what else they could have done there. It's not like a prostitute in this time period could, like, afford, like, a baby crib, right? So, that's an unfortunate circumstance, right? This, though, steps into the sin, right? She literally switched out babies and stole another person's kid. That's what the woman's accusing her of. And then, I mean, imagine this other woman, right? The first thing she does is she wakes up now, and there's a dead baby in her arms. But then as she looks at the dead baby, she realizes, I don't think this is my baby, right? Because I know they're only 3 days old, but a mother can tell, right? That's a different child. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, behold, he was dead. So she gets up in the morning, and she's going to start giving her kid milk, and the kid's not moving. And the child is dead. But when I looked at him carefully in the morning, behold, he was not my son whom I had born. Right? So once the initial shock left off, because obviously you would have immediately just assumed, oh my gosh, somebody switched out the babies.
Yeah.
She's like, what have I done to my child? But then as she looked closer, and like the panic started setting down, this is not my child. And then she probably looks over and sees the other woman nursing her kid and says, that's my child. Right? So all of a sudden, it's like, this is a not good scenario. Behold, he was not my son whom I had born. So she says, Solomon, here's the case. This is what happened. Right? But then the other woman says, no. For the living one's my son, the dead one's your son. AKA, you're a liar. Right? You're, like, basically, like, to summarize, she's basically saying all the above is true, except no babies were swapped. Right? This woman actually did kill her baby, and she's just in denial. And she's trying to act like I switched it because she really wants my kid. Right? So that's what the person's retaliating. Right? No. Don't act like I switched that. I would never do something like that. You're just jealous that my baby's still alive, and therefore you're trying to steal my baby from me. Gosh. But the first woman said, no, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son. Thus they spoke before the king. Oh, I'm getting a headache just hearing it.
Yeah.
Me too.
Like you realize this is a hard situation, right? It's just the testimony of two women going back and forth. There are no witnesses, and it's not like the babies are old enough to say which one's their mom, right? They're just a few days old. It's like, what do you do? Right? Well, to be fair, I don't know if they're just a few days old, right? They were 3 days apart whenever they were born. I don't know how much time has passed since then. But no matter what, this is not a good scenario, right? It genuinely seems like an impossible scenario. I don't know how you would fix this, right? But here we get to see the wisdom of Solomon. I think maybe what we should do here is, let's just take this one verse at a time, just to allow the drama to linger.
Then the king said, the one says, this is my son who is living, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, no, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.
All right. So Solomon right there, I think he's just doing what a wise person does. And he's just clarifying the situation. He says, all right, I've heard both of your points. So over here, this is what you're saying. And over here, this is what you're saying. Is that correct? Right? You can imagine them shaking, yes, that is what I'm saying. Right? That's always an important thing to do, right? If you're just trying to arrive at a wise decision, don't come to conclusions without clarifying what both sides mean. He says, okay, this one says, this is my son who is living, and your son's the dead one. The other says, no, for your son's the dead one, my son's the living one. Is that correct? Head shaking, yes. And now, honestly, I just imagine like everybody in the throne room just like leaning in, being like, how is Solomon going to handle this? Like they're probably locked in. Like this sounds like something out of a soap opera, right? They're like, how is this going to be solved? And then Solomon says what is probably the most surprising thing that nobody expected. Verse 24.
And the king said, get me a sword. So they brought a sword before the king.
Wait, what? It's like, oh no! Like this is like it's like this is where it's like it feels like Solomon has like a flair for the dramatic. But what he's gonna do here is brilliant.
Yeah.
But just imagine that you're sitting there and you're hearing this story and you're wondering, ooh, whose side is he gonna take? Like basically, it's a matter of like rhetoric, right? Who has the more convincing argument? And that's what everybody else is listening to. And then they're like, ooh, okay, so. Like, you know, they're probably picking sides. They're like, I think this girl's telling the truth. I think this girl's telling the truth. And then Solomon says, get me the sword. And they're like, wait, what? Hold up.
Whoa.
Why would you need a sword? Like, is the sword for one of the women? Is the sword for the baby? What is the sword for, Solomon? Like,
Everyone?
what? Like, why is a sword necessary in this scenario? Right? Like, this is I don't know. Like, I just love that. Like, I love the flair for the dramatic there. Were you saying something? Oh, okay. I just love that. It's like, go get the sword. And so they bring the sword. And like everybody's just like sitting on the edge of their seats, like sweating nervously. Probably especially the women. They're like, like for all they know, Solomon's just like ticked off. He's in a bad mood. He's like, you know what? I don't got time for this. Kill them all. Like, you know, like they have no idea, right? They're just like, oh, this is like what's about to happen. They probably did not see this happening. Like just like go get a sword. Okay. And then, verse 25.
Then the king said, divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other.
Oh. Ouch. No.
Oh!
No.
Everybody's sitting there and they're like, Solomon, what? Like, hold up.
What, you didn't
Solomon.
get
This dude's supposed to be wise.
Like, yes, you're supposed to be wise. And it's like basically, it's kind of funny because
You can't even get a mic.
if you don't, if you don't understand, you don't understand Solomon's wisdom, which I can guarantee you most of the people did not, it seems like he just does not understand what these women want, right? It's almost like, you know what? They both want the kid, cut them in half, they can have half the kid each. It sounds like somebody who literally just doesn't get it, right? It's like, you know what? Just cut them in half, you get half, then y'all are both happy. Is that right?
Split custody.
Yes, split custody. That's funny. It's terrible. But you can see how this is like, it seems foolish, right? But the wisdom of God seems foolish in the eyes of the world, doesn't it? Right? This is exactly what, Solomon's doing something extremely wise here, but from everybody else's eyes, it looks like the stupidest thing in the world, because tell us how to not read a room, right? What mother would be satisfied with this, right? Yeah, you know what? Just cut the baby in half, you get half, you get half. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate it. We're going to go home now. Nobody would be satisfied with this.
Yeah.
And so Solomon, either he's got to have an amazing plan up his sleeves, or he just likes causing trouble, right? And he really just doesn't care about these people, and he's just treating them like pawns in his game. And he's like, this would be a fun thing. I bet this will be a fun story. It's one of those two options, and it's really looking like the second one if you're just trying to pragmatically think through this, because it's hard to see how this is going to work out. But Solomon is a clever cookie, right? Because ultimately, what he's going to do is he's having them draw out the sword, but he's not having them draw out the sword in order to divide things. In the end, he's having them draw out the sword in order to bring unity and in order to bring peace. But it doesn't sound that way, right? He is grabbing the sword and he is suggesting that he's here to divide stuff up, but through that division, he's actually going to produce peace. Very similar to Jesus himself. Right? Jesus, he came not to bring peace, but a sword. Right? And he's going to draw the dividing line between fathers and their children and siblings and stuff like that. He's here to draw a dividing line, but through that dividing line, he will produce peace. That's what Solomon's doing. Right? Solomon, Shlomo, the man of peace, he's going to produce peace through this. Verse 26.
Then the woman whose son was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred with compassion over her son, and said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him."
Aha! There it is. Right there we have the solution that Solomon was looking for. Right? I love this. So Solomon, he actually had no desire. Well, read verse 27 too.
Then the king said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother."
There you go. All right. Solomon had no desire to actually kill the child. You see that? By no means put him to death. The dude's over here sharpening his sword. He's like, dude, did you think I was actually going to go through with this? Do you think I'm a monster? He's like, don't put him to death. He had no desire to actually put the child to death. What he wanted to do is he was wanting to test the two women, right? And he wanted to see what their true motivations were, right? And right here, we get to see that both of the women were willing to sacrifice the child. But they were both willing to sacrifice the child in different ways. Then the woman whose son was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred with compassion over her son, and said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." I don't know if y'all remember whenever at First Baptist Seabrook, whenever I was preaching through Exodus chapters 32 to 34, and God shows up and gives all this long list of his attributes, right? Slow to anger, abounding in love, filled with compassion. I talked about the Hebrew word for compassion whenever we went through that. Do you remember what I said the Hebrew word for compassion is closely related to? It comes from the Hebrew word for womb, right? Like the womb of a mother, right? So the word for compassion actually, it means like the longings of a womb, right? It's like a motherly love. That's the same word right here. She was deeply stirred with compassion. She was deeply stirred in her womb, right? It was her motherly love that overcame her, right? The woman whose son was the living one spoke to the king, for she was deeply stirred with compassion over her son, and said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." So what does this woman say?
She would rather her child live, but it not actually be like her child anymore, than for her child to die just so that she could have like part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, she says, you know what? If it means taking my child's life, don't do that. I would rather this child grow up in another household so long as he gets to live. So she is willing to sacrifice the child, but she's not willing to sacrifice the child's life. She's willing to sacrifice her own motherhood, right? And as long as the child lives, right? So she's willing to give the child up, but not to death, right? Because she loves the child. But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours, divide him." Well, what does this woman want?
She didn't really want the child.
Mm.
She doesn't want. She didn't want the child for herself. Neither the child for her. The other woman.
Yeah, because either way, she's already lost her kid, right? Her kid is dead. The only reason she'd switched the babies in the first place was because she wanted a chance to keep the kid, right? And so to her, it doesn't ultimately matter whether or not this kid dies, because I mean, she's already lost her kid, right? She was just trying to still be a mom, but the last thing she wants is for her child to be dead, and she has to live with that regret, while this other mother gets to live on, and she has to be publicly shamed for the fact that she did this whole thing, right? So she's like, you know what? No, I would rather the child die so that you don't get to be a mom, and you don't get to go and live a happy life, and so I don't have to be shamed for this. Let the kid die. Seems pretty heartless, but she's already proved herself a pretty heartless person. She switched out these babies. Right? She was already willing to take this child from the mother in the first place, because she took it from her arms and put a dead child there. Right? And so right here, the motives are revealed. Right? This is where the mask is ripped off the Scooby-Doo villain. Right? I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling King Solomon. Right? That's basically what's going on here. Right? To where you get to see the true motives coming out. One woman responds how a mother would respond. You know what? No, as long as my child lives, I don't care what happens. Do whatever it takes to keep him alive. The other one responds just how you would expect somebody to respond if they already accidentally killed their child and they were just trying to make themselves happy again by stealing somebody else's kid. Because really, misery loves company. And Solomon, he had a hearing heart, right? And he was hearing what they were saying, and it came down to just one testimony against the other. So he knew he needed to put them in a scenario where, depending on who was right, they would respond differently. Right? And so that's how he was able to discern it. Then the king said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." I don't know why this story, it reminds me of Genesis 22, with Abraham sacrificing Isaac. Right? There's just a lot of parallels there. Right? Where you have God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son, and Abraham is willing to do it, but then God stops him at the last moment and says, no, don't do that. I will provide. Right? There's some parallels there. Right? And actually, I was reading a commentary. It's the same commentary I read from before. Let me grab it real quick. Because it highlighted some other parallels. Like he actually brought up Genesis 22 as well. But he highlighted some other parallels with this passage that I just thought were really kind of cool. I'll read that to you all in a second just because I found it fascinating. But the king says, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." This is where Solomon is basically like Solomon Holmes, right? He's just a regular Sherlock Holmes. He has cracked the case. Elementary, dear Watson. Right? He's figured it out, right? He's a smart dude. He's a wise guy, right? And that's just what God said. Right? And so, real quick, before I read from this, read verse 28 for us, Sean.
Then all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had handed down, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice.
Very good. Yeah, I'd probably fear him too. I mean, crud, this guy's got some unorthodox manners, right? I mean, it's like trying to get to a judgment. It's like, pull out the sword. Oh, gosh. Yes.
He did the impossible.
He did, right? It was literally an impossible scenario, but he had a hearing heart.
Figured it out.
Yes. Like, he's literally, like, basically what he's doing is he's hearing the scenario, and he realizes, if I don't intervene with something dramatic, we're just going to be arguing back and forth. I need to do something to reveal their hearts, right? And so, what can I do other than put the child's life at stake, right? Because depending on, like, the mother will respond how a mother would respond, right? Because they can argue back and forth all they want. It's one testimony against the other. I need to do something that will make the mother's heart come out. All right. Well, how do you do that? Same way that God did it with Isaac, or with Abraham and Isaac. Okay, well, how did he test Abraham? Sacrifice your son. He wanted to see Abraham's heart. Well, the wisdom of God was in him. Like father, like son. Right? Just like God did, so Solomon does. Right? I think it's really cool. So all Israel heard of the judgment, which the king had handed down. They feared the king, for they saw the wisdom of God was in him. They're like, wow, now that is a great guy. Right? Like, this is really just cool stuff, right? This is like you really see, like, I don't know, I love, like, things are like going uphill here, right? Like, David was great, and now Solomon. I mean, whenever you're reading this, you got to realize that the way that the book of 1 Kings is presenting Solomon in these opening chapters is he is very Messiah-like, right? Like, he is establishing the kingdom of God. Like, the way that he responds to God's requests and stuff, like, he is checking off all the boxes. Like, he looks like the Messiah, and that's, once again, going to be why it's so heartbreaking whenever you get to the end. And he's not the Messiah. Scary. Okay, but some parallels I wanted to highlight real quick. Then we'll talk application, wrap this up. So the author here of the commentary, Peter Leithart, I quote him in a lot of stuff because I really like a lot of his commentaries. First off, he also highlighted some parallels between 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2 and this chapter, right? To where you have 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, you have two mothers, Haggith and Bathsheba, right? And then in this story, you have two mothers. And then in 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2, you have two sons, Adonijah and Solomon. Here you have two sons. In chapters 1 and 2, you have Bathsheba pleading for the life of her child Solomon. In this chapter, you have a mother pleading for the life of a child. In chapters 1 and 2, Bathsheba pleads for Adonijah, who dies. Remember, that was in chapter 2, where she comes and pleads on behalf of Adonijah, but he ends up getting killed. Well, in this one chapter, you have one mother who accepts the death of a son. Chapters 1 and 2, Adonijah dies. In this chapter, one of the sons dies. In chapters 1 and 2, Solomon was rescued from the threat of Adonijah. And in this chapter, one of the sons is rescued from the threat of the sword. In chapters 1 and 2, David passes judgment in favor of Bathsheba. And in this chapter, Solomon passes judgment. So there's parallels, right? Things that, like, these are things that, like, I often overlook. One good thing that this guy does is that he notices a lot of the parallels in the Bible. I just think that's really good. But this is what he has to say in regards to Genesis 22. The story told by the prostitutes has an eerie resemblance. He also talks about Passover. It has an eerie resemblance to the Passover. The exchange of sons takes place at nighttime, as does Passover, right? Whenever it's talking about, like, the firstborn and stuff like that. And as at the Passover, one male child dies while another is delivered. This suggests that the false mother is Egypt, a Pharaoh-like woman who smothers her own children and then seeks to toss Israelite children into the Nile, right? If you go to the book of Exodus. Endowed with Yahweh's wisdom, the king comes with a sword to kill as the angel of Yahweh frees the sons of the Israelites under the threat from Pharaoh. Passover is itself a reenactment of the Genesis 22 story, the binding of Isaac. And 1 Kings chapter 3 is redolent with allusions to that story as well. Both the true mother and the false are willing to sacrifice the living son, but the true mother sacrifices the son in order to save him, while the other sacrifices to destroy. Through this test, Solomon discerns which woman is the true Israelite, the true daughter of Abraham, who, like Abraham, gives up her child in faith to save him. Following Abraham's offer of Isaac, Genesis 22:17 records Yahweh's first promise to multiply Israel like the sand of the sea. A similar sequence appears in 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4. A prostitute acts like an Abraham by giving up her own son And in the following chapter, we read that Israel became as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore. We're going to see that in next week's chapter. The first time that this phrase is applied to Israel as it actually exists, rather than as a promise of what it would be. I just found that interesting, right? I just think that the parallels there are kind of cool. You don't want to read too much into them, but I do think that whenever the authors of Scripture are writing this stuff, they're writing it with the previous books in mind, right? And so there are certain references that they make that even if there's not like a theological connection to be made, there's an emotional connection to be made, right? So when you're reading this story, it should feel like the anxiety that the people felt at the Passover, right? Or the anxiety that Abraham probably felt whenever he was going to sacrifice Isaac. There's actually a really interesting book by Soren Kierkegaard, a philosopher, the father of existentialism. But he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling. And it's all like the whole book is dedicated to like exploring how Abraham might have felt in Genesis 22 story. It's very interesting. Okay, to wrap this up, application. What do y'all think?
Seek the wisdom of God
Okay.
above the wisdom of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say one thing is, even though we're not like a king ruling over a group of people, that maybe it could be something that we pray to like ask God to give us a listening heart, so that whenever like we're walking around and we're encountering other people, like how can I better love the people around me, or how can I like discern different situations and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing. Like just practical example. Like I've had a student recently who's been coming up to me, and she's been asking me some very difficult questions, like just practical things, and that's something that I'm longing for. I want a listening heart, because my temptation is to give just clear, concise answers, right? Just to show that I have the wisdom to like know how to handle the situation. But some of the stuff she's asking me is very nuanced stuff, and it's like one of those things where you have to like view it not from my perspective, like how would I handle this, but it's like, well, how should you handle this from your perspective, like in your own walk of life? Like you have to see it from their perspective, right? And you have to try to give them advice that actually is the appropriate thing for them, because the way that we would handle it might be differently, right? And I think that that's something that we can try to learn in all of our different interactions. We have to realize that we do need that listening heart. But we also might want to pray for the strength to apply it in our own lives, because that's going to be Solomon's pitfall. He's great at giving wisdom to other people. He's terrible when it comes to applying it himself. That's going to be the bad thing for him. He's got the wisdom, but he very rarely applies it in his own life, which is heartbreaking. But yeah, I think that's a big part. Anything else? I think there's a metaphorical way we could apply this stuff. Whenever Solomon was caught between a rock and a hard place and he didn't know how to discern between anything, he told people to bring out the sword. I think we should also bring out the sword whenever we need to, make a judgment,
Yep.
right? But we should bring it out for the same reasons, right? We should bring it out for the same reasons he did, right? He was not actually wanting to divide the baby, right? And there, unfortunately, are a lot of Christians who, whenever they get into debates with people and they're trying to come to correct answers, their goal is division, right? They are simply arguing for the sake of arguing. Our goal should never be that. If we bring out the sword, the goal should always be to actually arrive at truth and to ultimately produce shalom, right? Peace, right? That should be the goal, right? It should be to have a listening heart and to arrive at the correct answer that honors both God and respects man, right? It should never be, I'm going to bring out the sword, I'm going to prove you wrong. That's not what we should do, right? I probably don't recommend bringing out an actual sword unless you're wanting to get thrown in jail. But there's a metaphorical way to apply that, I guess.
I like that.
What? Bring out the sword. Fun fact, when I was at A&M, I helped out at Breakaway Ministries as a volunteer. And there would be places where like they'd give out like free Bibles to like people who were coming for the first time, like guests. And I'll never forget this. It just cracked me up. There was one time they had like a bunch of high schoolers who were on a field trip, and they decided to come to, I guess it was a private school. They came on a field trip to College Station to go to Breakaway. And they came in the door. And the volunteers at the Bible stand, they were standing there, they were yelling, "Free swords! Free swords!" man, all the guys in that group, they were so excited. They like ran over. They're like, "What? Free swords?" And they're like, "Yeah, you want a Bible?" They're like, "Oh, yeah, I guess so." And like, I've never seen them look so like they were so excited. They thought that they just like landed on the jackpot. They showed up for like a Christian conference thing, and then they were being offered free swords. They're like, "Heck yeah!" And it was a Bible. Like that's like one of my favorite memories from that. It's like a core memory, just like stashed in there. All right, any other application things that y'all can think of? There's really a lot, but we've gone over time already. Even though it was a shorter chapter, but we got to go more in depth, which is good. And yeah, this is the type of Solomon you want to be like, right? You want to be a 1 Kings chapter 3 Solomon. You do not want to be a 1 Kings chapter 11 Solomon. It's also a really sad thing when it comes to the Bible. It's like every time things are going uphill, you know that it can't go uphill for long because Jesus is a long time away. And you're like, oh, this is not good. Like it's like whenever a wave is like building up, you're like, oh, this is about to crash really hard. So
roller coaster.
well, exactly like that, right? It's like it's going up, and you're like, oh, this is really fun. Oh no, I know where this is heading. It's like, you hear like the.
You don't hear it?
Yeah, it's like it starts clicking, and you're like, oh, this is not good.
And the higher it goes, the worse going down it's going to be.
Well, no, exactly, and that's what's gonna
You
happen.
just have like a little bit. Well, that's just like a kiddie roller coaster. But like if you keep going up, you're like you have a big drop.
And that's the hard part with Solomon, because Solomon is going to see Israel to the height of its prosperity, and then the year that he dies, the kingdom's going to split in two.
Yeah.
That is heart, like it's heartbreaking, right? Especially because it's like the author wants you to view him as a Messiah figure, right? To where you're reading it and you're like, is this the guy? Could this be him? And then like whenever it ends, it's like all in one chapter. You're like, oh, what happened? So yeah, it's heartbreaking. Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. We praise you for your word. We praise you for your wisdom. And as we leave here, God, we want to repeat the request of Solomon, not because you showed up to us in a dream and asked us the same thing, but simply because we love you and we know that you are a gracious God who loves to give things to his people. And because we recently went through the book of James, and James said that if any of you lacks wisdom, we should ask of you, and we should ask in faith. And that's what we're going to do, God. So right now, right here, we pray to you. And God, I pray that you would give us hearing hearts, that we could discern between right and wrong, that we would know how you define good and how you define evil, and that we would live our lives by those definitions, and that we would judge rightly amongst your people, so that we would be able to better love and better serve one another as willful slaves of a gracious and amazing King. Thank you, God. We praise you. In your name we pray. Amen.